My lords, I declare my interest in a family business that rents properties in Norwich in some small way to students, and I suppose I ought to declare I've been a student myself in both houses and halls, albeit over 40 years ago. Now, this is a well-intentioned bill. Indeed, the Conservatives introduced something thematically similar in the last session, and it includes some modernisations to rebalance that relationship between the landlord and tenant, and particularly to regulate the agents who act as intermediaries between the parties. But this is not the same bill we encountered before. And in respect of students, and I'm bound to say of all students, including apprentices, it's pregnant with unintended consequences, because as it relates to students, it denies the obvious fact amongst the cohort of potential tenants there is an annual rhythm to the demands and needs that runs from December to August annually. Now, I was particularly taken with Lord Cromwell, who's just left his place, because I was going to offer to buy him a drink in that round of, in the bar with Baroness Thornhill. He tells me he doesn't drink, so it would have been a cheap round, but there we are. Now, as a principle, efficient markets exist to align with consumer needs, and this bill will disrupt the ability of the market to satisfy those needs of the many hundreds of thousands of students, not all of whom are fresh out of the sixth form college, to align the certainty of their living arrangements with the reality of their daily lives, and particularly amongst their friends, or with their friends. Now, for the consequence of the bill, if enacted, means that students will pay more, because the supply of rental properties will reduce by discriminating against private landlords. It will reduce the choice of landlord, because it lays down in statute the sole type of landlord counterparty that students can contract with if they wish to have the certainty of an annual let, and thus it reduces the competitive pressure amongst landlords to keep prices down. So students will pay more. By restricting the student let to a certain class of building, it creates monopoly powers for that expensive specialist provider that my dear friend Lord Willett has mentioned. So students will pay more. And it will create an overheated market in September every year, because the landlord can only guarantee to have availability of his house if the previous people have given notice. And so in that overheated September market, guess what? Students will pay more. But it isn't just cost, it's the consequence of the bill means that students will be more inconvenienced. It means that second and third year students, the sort of people who don't necessarily want to live in hall, must fly back from a world trip or working abroad, whatever, so to sort out a house they could have done earlier. It's harder for friendship groups to get the certainty of a house with their friends, and I don't believe that in this debate thus far we've considered the importance of cohorts of friends who aren't related, don't have those family ties as you often get in most tenancies. So you're at the mercy of the person who just wants to cut and run. Because if there's a joint tenancy amongst 6 friends, for example, in a larger house, and one of them wants to go, what does that do? Does that break the tenancy? How does that work? And I don't believe it disrupts the whole group. And I do believe that in the case of students, the discipline of a group of friends coming together has some value to the market. Of course, by focusing everything in September, it makes the chaos of clearing even more chaotic than it already is. And it prefers the established students from good backgrounds, with parents with sharp elbows, as a means to execute draft contracts more quickly. And it also makes it, those sort of families, easier to provide the guarantor. Now, I remember when my daughter was at Newcastle and she'd taken in with a group of friends, going to live in Jesmond, and there were 6 of them in the house, and the landlord sent round this contract, and the contract made me jointly and severally liable for the entire rent for all of the people, none of whom I'd met. But unfortunately, I was last on the list, and I noticed that Viscount Boyne, a former member of this house, had signed before me, and it gave me a certain comfort, knowing that we were going to vicariously rely on each other. Now, whilst this bill introduces protections for current students, it disadvantages those people in the second year or third year who aren't students yet, who aren't in houses yet, and who might want to be, because not everybody wants to live in halls, particularly for students of PhDs or mature students, and I've been there. you tire of the freshers running up and down the hall, the corridor in the night, because they come back late from the pub. If you want to have that quiet enjoyment of a property, then you shouldn't be forced into a student block with added charges and expensive rents. But, my lords, this bill, if enacted, will introduce new discriminations that haven't been mentioned thus far. And I'm thinking about foreign students. And let's not forget that foreign students underpin the university sector. At the moment, they are keeping our universities afloat with their extra fees. Because foreign students who, for whatever reason, and there are cultural reasons I'll dwell on in a moment, who don't have a credit history, who will be prevented from paying up front, they will become unrentable, will find it very difficult to get a place. And of course, these are the people who need to balance, the universities need to balance the books. The difficulty of getting guarantors, the right to rent checks in and of themselves are sometimes a barrier, a discrimination against foreign students. But I'm particularly thinking of women students from Arab countries. And I have two tenants in our own business whose mothers have come from these parts of the world to live with their daughters for cultural reasons. And they want the certainty of the annual tenancy agreement to give them, in their own way, certainty. So they need to sort it out once. They can then have the comfort of leaving their daughters, because they do tend to be daughters, there, whilst they're having they can come back. So, I mean, it's an irony that later in this in this bill, Amendment 190 has huge things about discriminating against pets. And here we are not allowing discrimination against the cultures of women and girls from other parts of the world. Now, I regret to say that all of this in aggregate means that the landlords who've specialised in renting to students, and many of whom add pastoral care to the portfolio, and they'll fall away. My wife has acted as mother, so to speak, to many of our students and helped them with council tax bills, acted on behalf of utilities, especially for those students for whom English isn't their first language, trying to make a way in a foreign country. My lords, all this will go because you cannot have the certainty of contract between landlord and tenant. And so why should it be for the state to determine a narrow monoculture of what constitutes acceptable student accommodation? What happened to the ability of consenting adults to work out their own decisions? Government Amendment 202 has the absurdity of defining a building that is occupied by students, which excludes dwelling houses that are occupied by students, and then requiring the halls specifically built for students and meeting Unipol code standards to be licensed even though they exceed the standards. Now, how does this pettifogging bureaucratic interfering help the people it purports to assist? And it took my daughter, when I explained to her last weekend what I was going to say, about 10 seconds to realise that quite a complicated secondary market is now going to develop between potential students and between landlords, because informal, unregulated contracts and options and fees to secure tenancies in the most desirable households with the most commodious landlords in a way that harms exactly the sort of people the government's trying to help, the ones first in their family to go to university. By preventing more than 1 month being paid at a time, you're going to end up with more complicated escrow arrangements with fees, more expense, delay and obfuscation, and all sorts of connivances between the cohorts of outgoing tenants with incoming tenants, on risk, of course, lining up the next year based on good friendships this year. I mean, we are formalising in statute nepotism between years to the exclusion of those who are trying to make their way. My lords, the student market is complex and it should reflect the world as it is. And for many students, that's not the monoculture of high catered halls of residence. They prefer to be in the town, close to pubs and universities. So destroying this market doesn't help anybody. It's full of the law of unintended consequence, a law that makes it harder and worse for the brightest and best people who want to get on, difficult for anyone in higher education to know where they stand, and they'll all pay more and make it easier for landlords to exploit a hot market every September. So it's just another example of Labour preferring the big business, the operators of these large student schemes, over the nobility of the small family business. But there is one silver lining, though. Teaching students at a formative moment in their lives the adverse effects of the dead hand of the nanny state, telling them what they can and can't do, is more likely to drive them and promote the cause of capitalism than it is socialism.
My lords.